The knock that mattered came not at a door, but on the flagstones of the forecourt, in the hard clop of a duke's boots crossing to where widow Hester Coombes stood with her shawl pulled tight despite the August heat, and Grace Marlowe, who had been carrying a tray of correspondence across the hall, stopped in the doorway and did not go on. She did not yet know that the argument she was about to have would be repeated, in one form or another, by half the county before Michaelmas. Had she known, she would have set down the tray and walked out to the forecourt all the same. £40, Mrs. Coombes, the Duke of Wraxham, was saying, in the low-level voice of a man reading a sentence rather than passing judgment. A year in arrears. I have Reeve's figures before me. And Reeve's figures do not lie. Widow Coombes' hands, chapped from 30 years of dough and washing, twisted the corner of her apron, and she said nothing, because there was nothing a widow could say to a duke that a duke was obliged to hear. Grace set the tray down on the hall table herself and went out into the sun. Gideon Ashcombe was a tall man, built more like a man who worked than a man who was served, with a groove between his brows that grief and 2 years of debt had worn there and never quite let heal. And when he turned to find a stranger, for she was to him still very nearly a stranger, 6 weeks into her post as his mother's companion, he did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. This does not concern you, Miss Marlowe. It concerns the almshouse ledger, your Grace, which is my charge, and which shows Mrs. Coombes' rent paid quarterly and in full through Lady Day. Then the almshouse ledger is wrong. Or Mr. Reeve's is. You forget yourself, Miss Marlowe. I forget nothing, your Grace, Grace said. That is rather my difficulty. Behind the Duke, at the edge of the steps, a slim, immaculate man in a coat too fine for a land agent's salary stood with his hands folded and his face arranged into patient sorrow, and something in the set of his mouth, not quite a smile, not quite anything a jury could have named, made Grace file the sight away, the way her father had taught her to file away a column that would not balance. Silas Reeve inclined his head toward the Duke, as if to say he was sorry it had come to this, and it was that small, sorry inclination, more than anything spoken, that told Grace she had found the beginning of something. The forecourt had gathered its audience by then, as forecourts do, a boy with a wheelbarrow, 2 maids at an upstairs window, the widow's own granddaughter clutching her skirts, and it was into this stillness that a door opened on the terrace above, and the Dowager Duchess of Wraxham came down the 3 stone steps with her shawl settled over one shoulder like a woman drawing a line under a sum. She had been sitting inside the morning-room window the whole quarter of an hour, and she had heard every word of it. Gideon, 1 word, and the boy with the wheelbarrow stopped pretending not to listen. The Duke turned. "Mother, this is a matter of rents, this is a matter of my hall," the Dowager said, "and I did not raise a son to be cruel to widows in it." She came to stand beside Grace, not behind her, and she did not touch her, and she did not need to, the whole forecourt understood. In the space of that single unhurried stride, precisely whose side had just been taken. "Mrs. Coombes' mother nursed me through the fever the year I was married into this house," the Dowager went on, "and I will not stand on my own steps and watch her granddaughter turned into the road on the word of a ledger I have never once been shown." The Duke looked from his mother to Grace to the small folded figure of his land agent, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite anger and not quite doubt, but the first cold draught of both. "Very well," he said at last, and the 2 words cost him something visible, a tightening at the jaw that Grace, already reading him the way she read every ledger placed in front of her. marked and kept. The accounts will be reviewed. Properly, by McCalmus. 6 weeks. He said it as though it were generosity, and perhaps, from a man who had learned to measure kindness in weeks rather than sentiment, it was. If the arrears stand, he said to the widow, not unkindly now, only tired, you will pay them, or you will go. If they do not, he did not finish the sentence. He looked instead at Reeve, and Reeve met the look with the same patient, sorrowful incline of the head he had given the whole scene, and it was that stillness, that perfect and unbothered stillness, that Grace would remember longest, afterward, as the moment the true shape of the thing had stood in plain daylight, and no one but her had yet learned to see it. She was sent for within the hour, which she had expected, and shown into the library, which she had not. She had thought a rebuke would come in the passage, quick and low, not in the room lined floor to ceiling, with the accumulated authority of 6 generations of Ashcombe men. Gideon Ashcombe stood at the window with his back to the door, when she entered, his hand closed loosely around the signet ring on his smallest finger, a habit she would come to know as the outward sign of an inward reckoning. "You embarrassed me in my own forecourt," he said, without turning. "I corrected you in your own forecourt," Grace said. "There is a difference, Your Grace, though I grant it may not always feel like one from where you stand." He turned then. "You are very free with your opinions for a woman 6 weeks in my mother's employ. I am free with facts, not opinions. The Almshouse ledger is a fact. I have kept it myself since April, and I copied Mrs. Coombes' receipts into it in my own hand, from her own scraps of paper, because she cannot write and does not trust a purse she cannot count. And Reeve's ledger is also a fact. Then one of 2 facts is false, and I should like the chance to find out which, before a widow of 60 loses the roof her husband built with his own 2 hands. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look she had learned, in a harder school than this one, to hold without flinching. "If you are wrong," he said finally, "you will have made an enemy of the one man who has kept this estate solvent since my father died, and you will leave my mother's service in disgrace. And if I am right?" Then Reeve answers for it. "And you may keep your position, and my apology besides. Though I warn you, I give those out more rarely than my thanks. I had not noticed you gave out thanks at all, Your Grace." Something almost like amusement crossed his face, and was gone before it could properly arrive, but Grace marked that too. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, found her 20 minutes later wringing not her hands but a duster she had forgotten she was holding, and delivered her verdict without being asked for it, as was her custom. "Told him off in the forecourt, did you? In front of God and the 2nd footman?" Well, she sniffed. About time somebody did. His Grace has been letting that man Reeve run tame since old His Grace died, and grief makes fools of the best of us, though it takes a particular kind of fool to mistake a land agent for a saint. "You do not trust Mr. Reeve. I do not trust a man whose linen is cleaner than his conscience," Mrs. Pruitt said. "And I have buried 2 husbands and outlived a bishop, so I know what I am talking about." Grace found she liked her enormously, and said so, and was rewarded with the housekeeper's first real laugh, dry as a hinge. It was Mrs. Pruitt, too, who first asked, gently, over tea gone lukewarm in the servants' hall, where a girl with such a head for figures had learned her trade, and Grace, who had told no one at Hallowmere the whole of it, found herself answering. Her father, she said, had been a land agent too, at an estate 3 counties distant, a good one, trusted 20 years, until an accusation of falsified accounts had cost him his post, his name, and in the end his life. Dead in a debtor's room 2 winters past, with nothing left to leave his daughter but a ledger book of his own private keeping, and a single sentence he had made her memorize before she could properly write. A ledger does not lie, he had told her. Only the hand that keeps it does. And you believed him innocent, Mrs. Pruitt said. It was not a question. I believe it still, Grace said. I have simply never had the chance to prove it. Perhaps that is why I could not let this one go by. Silas Reeve came to find her 3 days later in the small estate office where the almshouse ledger lived, and he came alone, and he came smiling, which Grace had already begun to understand was the most dangerous thing about him. Miss Marlowe, I hear we are to be auditors together. He set down a second ledger, his own, bound in the same green cloth as hers, and opened it to a page already marked with a ribbon, as though he had known precisely which page she would need. I welcome it. Truly, a man in my position cannot object to scrutiny, or he invites suspicion he does not deserve. No one has suggested you deserve suspicion, Mr. Reeve, have they not? He said it lightly, turning a page with one clean finger, and his voice never rose above the register of a man discussing the weather. Forgive me. I have kept these books 11 years, Miss Marlowe, since before His Grace's father was cold in his grave, and I have watched this estate through debts that would have broken a lesser house. I only mean to say, an audit is a fine thing for a woman who has never had to answer for a column of figures with a family's roof riding on the sum of it. It is a harder thing for a man who has. My father answered for such a column, Grace said, and it broke him, though the figures were never his to begin with. I find I have a great deal of patience for hard things, Mr. Reeve, and very little for men who mistake gentleness for weakness. Something flickered behind his composure then, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all, and he closed the ledger with a small, precise sound. How unfortunate for your father, he said, that he had no one so loyal in his corner as Mrs. Coombe has found in you. And he bowed, and left her alone with 2 ledgers, and a window full of August light, and it was only after the door had closed that Grace let out the breath she had been holding since he walked in. Below in the servants' hall, she knew a book had already opened on the outcome. Mrs. Pruitt had told her so, delighted. 3-1 against the widow, and rather better odds than that against the new companion lasting the season. And above in the drawing-room the county's mothers had begun paying calls with a frequency that had nothing to do with the dowager's health, and everything to do with Duke 6 weeks from Michaelmas and, it was rumoured, considering his cousin. Miss Louisa Fenwick arrived that same week, golden and correct, and entirely unbothered by rumour, and took Grace's measure across the drawing-room with the swift, complete arithmetic of a woman who had been raised to marry well, and saw no reason a companion's opinions should complicate the sum. It was in poring over the ribbon-marked page Reeve had left behind, that evening, candle burned low, that Grace found the first thread worth pulling. An entry for Michaelmas rents 2 years past, Widow Coomb's line among a column of others, the ink of the figure itself a shade darker, a shade newer, than the ink of the name beside it, as though the number had been written into a space that had not at first held one. She did not yet know what it meant. She only knew, the way she had known her father's hands shook for a month before anyone else noticed, that it meant something, and she copied the page into her own book before she blew out the candle, because a fact unwritten, her father used to say, is only a suspicion wearing a fact's coat. The work went faster with 2 sets of hands than one, and it was the Duke himself, 3 evenings later, who came down to the estate office long after the household had gone to bed, and found her still bent over the columns by a single candle, and did not send her up to her room as etiquette required, but pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down instead. "You will ruin your eyes," he said. "You will ruin your evening," Grace said, "if you mean to sit there and watch me work rather than help me." He almost smiled. He took up the second ledger without being asked twice, and for an hour there was no sound in the room but pages turning and the scratch of her pencil, and something in the shared quiet unknotted a little of the wariness between them, the way work will, when 2 people are given a true thing to do together instead of a performance to give each other. "Your father taught you this," he said, not quite a question, somewhere past midnight. "He did. And the accusation against him. You never told me the whole of it." "Because I do not have the whole of it," Grace said, and heard her own voice go careful. "I have the shape of it. A man came forward with figures that showed my father had been skimming rents for years, and the estate believed the figures over 20 years of my father's word. Because figures are easier to believe than character, your Grace, and cheaper to check. There is a piece of that story I have never been able to prove, and I will not tell it to you as fact until I can, because I have seen what happens to a man ruined on someone else's word instead of his own evidence. But I will tell you this much. I do not think my father was the only honest man ever to be hanged by another man's ledger." He was quiet long enough that she looked up from her page. "My father trusted Reeve absolutely," he said finally. "Told me, before he died, that a man who could keep this estate's books through 2 bad harvests without once asking for more than his salary was worth more than half the peers I would ever sit beside in the Lords. I have gone on trusting him because I did not know how to do otherwise without unmaking everything my father believed. Trust is not the same as proof." "No," he agreed, "it is not." And something in the admission cost him visibly, the same tightening at the jaw she had seen in the forecourt, though gentler now, turned inward rather than out. She told him then the small joke her father used to make about land agents who wore their honesty on their coat buttons instead of in their accounts, and it was clumsy and not especially funny, and the Duke of Wraxham laughed anyway, a short, surprised bark of a sound, as though the laugh had gotten out before he had given it permission, and then looked so startled by his own laughter that Grace found she was smiling before she could stop herself. "That is the first time I have heard you do that," she said. "Do what? Laugh as though you meant it." He did not answer, but he did not look away either, and the candle between them burned another half-inch before either of them remembered the hour. The blow, when it came dressed as help. Reeve requested an audience with the Duke on the Tuesday, 10 days before Michaelmas, and Grace was summoned to it, and she understood within the first minute that she had been called in not as an ally, but as a defendant. "I have found something troubling, Your Grace," Reeve said, laying a sheet before him with the sorrowful care of a man delivering a diagnosis he wished were not his to give. An entry in the almshouse ledger, in Miss Marlowe's own hand, dated after the audit began, altering a sum already recorded. "I would not have brought it forward. I have the highest respect for Miss Marlowe's diligence, but a discrepancy of this kind, discovered mid-audit, is precisely the sort of thing that must be laid before you honestly, whatever the cost to any of us." Grace's stomach went cold before her mind caught up to why. She had made that correction, a transposed figure, an honest slip in her own first week's copying, fixed in the margin exactly as her father had taught her to fix any error, openly, dated, initialed. She said so. "I do not doubt you believe that, Miss Marlowe," Reeve said, with the particular gentleness of a man laying down a winning hand slowly enough to be admired for it. But you will forgive me if I observe that a woman whose own father was disgraced over falsified figures might have, understandable, forgivable, reasons to wish very much that this particular widow's arrears did not exist. Grief does strange things to arithmetic. The room went very still. Grace felt the Duke's eyes on her, and for one terrible moment she watched him do the thing she had feared from the very first, weigh her against 11 years of a man his father had trusted, and find the newer scale lighter. "It is an honest correction," she said, and heard how thin the words sounded in a room built for grander declarations. "Dated, initialed. You may compare the ink to any other correction in that book, Mr. Reeve, and find they match." "I should like nothing better," Reeve said, "than to be proven wrong." Gideon looked at the page a long time. "I will need to see the book," he said at last, and his voice gave away nothing, and that, more than any accusation, was the thing that frightened her, because a man who has learned to hide his verdict has already, in some private courtroom of his own mind, begun to reach one. He did not send her away that night, but he did not defend her either, and the difference sat between them for 3 days, like a third person in every room. On the 4th, Reeve returned, this time without the Duke present, and found her alone in the estate office, and set down beside her a folded paper she did not need to open to recognise as a bank draft. "A generous character reference," he said, "and a sum sufficient to see you comfortably to whatever situation you next choose, provided you withdraw your claims about the widow's ledger and remove yourself from Hallowmere before quarter day. No accusation need follow you, no scandal need touch your father's name a second time. I am offering you, Miss Marlowe, the exit your own father was never given. You are offering me his silence," Grace said, dressed up as kindness. "I am offering you a future." He had none left to take. She looked at the draft a long moment, and thought of her father's room, the smell of damp plaster and unpaid coal, the way his hands had shaken folding his last letter to her, and thought too of Widow Coomb's granddaughter clutching a fistful of skirt on the forecourt stones, and she pushed the paper back across the desk with 2 fingers, the way she might have pushed away something already spoiled. "No," she said. "You will regret that," Reeve said, and for the first time the gentleness in his voice had a seam in it, a thread of something colder showing through. "I regret a great many things, Mr. Reeve," Grace said, "but I find refusing a bribe is never among them, whatever it costs me after," and she went back to her columns, and did not look up again until she heard the door close, and only then did she let her hands, which had been perfectly steady the entire interview, begin at last to shake. The dismissal came 2 days later, delivered not by the Duke himself, but by a note in Reeve's careful hand, countersigned, she saw with a small private grief sharper than she expected, by Gideon, her access to both ledgers suspended, her movements about the estate office curtailed, pending the formal audit at Michaelmas, for which her presence would no longer be required. She was not turned out of the house, the dowager would not have permitted it, and did not, sweeping into Grace's small room that same evening in a fury of silk and lavender water that made the candle flames bow sideways. "He is a fool," the dowager said, "and he is my son, and I have never in 61 years found those 2 facts mutually exclusive. He believes the evidence, your Grace, not me. He believes he cannot afford to be wrong twice in one summer, which is a different thing entirely, and a great deal more cowardly." The dowager sat, straightened her rings, and regarded Grace with an attention that felt, for the first time, entirely without pity. "I did not rise in that forecourt for your sake, child, whatever the servants have been saying below stairs. I rose because my son forgot whose hall it was. He seems to have forgotten again. I find I am obliged to remind him a second time, though I confess I had hoped once would suffice for a man of his intelligence. Widow Combe herself sent word 2 mornings after that, not through the front of the house, but through the kitchen. A folded scrap carried by her granddaughter with dirt still under her nails from the garden. A message asking Grace to come, quietly, before Michaelmas, because there was something under the hearthstone her husband had put there before he died that she had never thought to show anyone, not thinking it mattered, until she heard tell of ink and dates, and a lady who could read a ledger the way other women read scripture. Grace went that same night, by the kitchen door and the back lane, past windows dark with sleeping households, her heart beating harder than the distance warranted, and knelt on the widow's swept floor, while Hester Combe worked a loose stone free with a poker, and drew out a tin box gone soft with rust, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth against 30 years of damp, a stack of receipts signed in a small, precise, unmistakable hand, Silas Reeve's own, for rent paid, quarter upon quarter, going back further than either woman had thought to hope. Grace held the topmost receipt to the candle, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very certain, the way a room goes quiet before a storm breaks. It proved the widow innocent. It did not yet prove why a man already comfortable, already trusted, already secure, would risk his whole 11 years of standing to steal from a woman who had nothing. That question, Grace understood, kneeling on the cold swept floor with the truth finely warm in her hands, was the one that would either save her or finish her, and she did not yet know which. She had 6 days left before Michaelmas, and on the first of them Mrs. Pruitt came to her, with her apron still dusted with flour, and her face for once entirely without its customary dryness. "I heard him," she said, without preamble. Reeve, talking to himself in the estate office, thinking the house asleep, saying something about the old book needing to go in the fire before quarter day. "I have kept this house's keys 40 years, Miss Marlowe, and I know every loose board and false drawer in it, and if there is an old book of his, I mean to find it before he finds his matches." It took them the better part of a night, working by a single shielded lamp, before Mrs. Pruitt's blunt fingers found the false back of Reeve's own writing desk, and behind it a second ledger. Green bound like the first but older, its early pages in a hand not yet perfected into the immaculate copperplate Reeve now wrote. A young man's hand, careless in places, and it was there, cross-referencing dates against her father's private book, carried with her always, the one inheritance she had never let out of her keeping, that Grace found the piece she had not known she was still searching for. A name in Reeve's young unpractised hand, from 11 years before he ever came to Hallamere, a junior clerk's post at an estate 3 counties distant, under a land agent named Aldous Marlowe, terminated within the year under circumstances the entry did not trouble to explain. Followed within 18 months by an anonymous letter to that same estate's trustees, in a hand disguised, but not disguised well enough, alleging fraud against the very man who had trained him. Grace sat with the 2 books open before her, her father's honest ruled columns, and Reeve's furtive self-congratulating record of a theft she had spent 3 years believing was simply the world's ordinary cruelty, and found that her hands, for the first time since her father's funeral, were entirely steady. She did not weep. There would be time enough for weeping, she thought, and this was not it. This was the hour for something colder and more useful than grief. She sent for Josiah Selwyn, the family's solicitor and trustee, that same night, with a letter that named no names and asked only that he come to Hallamare before Michaelmas, and bring with him whatever authority the law allowed a man to bring into a duke's own hall. And then, because there was one door left that pride alone would not let her leave closed, she went to find Gideon Ashcombe, and laid both books, and the widow's receipts besides, on the desk between them without a word of preamble, and watched him understand, in the space of turning 3 pages, precisely how much he had nearly lost by choosing loyalty to a hand over the evidence of a page. Michaelmas morning came in grey and still, the kind of stillness that precedes weather rather than promises its absence, and by 10 o'clock the great hall at Hallamare held more witnesses than it had seen since the old Duke's funeral. Tenants come to pay their quarter's rent as custom required. Josiah Selwyn seated at the long table with his spectacles and his patient, unhurried authority. The dowager upright in her chair with her rings still for once, and Louisa Fenwick standing near the window with the careful blankness of a woman who had heard whispers all week and did not yet know which way to arrange her face. Silas Reeve stood where he had always stood, at the Duke's right hand, immaculate, composed, and it was that composure, more than anything, that Grace meant to spend the morning taking apart. "Mr. Selwyn has come," Gideon said, when the room had settled, "to review the estate's accounts, at my request, and at the request of my mother, and in the presence of these witnesses, because a woman's home is not a thing to be decided in a private room." He did not look at Grace as he said it, but she understood the sentence was. In its own careful way, an apology already half-spoken, Reeve inclined his head, the same patient, sorrowful incline he had given the forecourt 6 weeks before. "I welcome the review, your Grace, as I have said from the first." "Then you will not object," Grace said, stepping forward, to comparing this receipt. She laid it flat on the table, in the grey light through the tall windows, against the arrears entry in your ledger for the same quarter. Selwyn took up the receipt, and the ledger, and held them side by side to the window, and the room went very quiet while he did, quiet enough that Grace heard the widow's granddaughter, brought along for reasons no one had quite explained, humming to herself near the door, entirely unaware that a family's whole fortune balanced on the next several minutes. "The hand on this receipt," Selwyn said at last, in the mild, unhurried voice of a man who had spent 30 years being unimpressed by liars, "and the hand in this ledger are the same hand, Mr. Reeve, your hand. Which means either you collected this rent and recorded it unpaid, or you did not collect it at all, and forged your own signature for a sum you never received. I confess I cannot think what third explanation you might offer." Reeve's composure did not crack all at once. It went the way ice goes on a slow river, a fine white line first, then another, and it was Ned Corrie, the young rent-collector standing white-faced near the wall, who broke before his master did. "He made me do it," Ned said, the words tearing loose of him before he seemed to have decided to speak them at all. "Told me which figures to change, said it was estate business, said a man my age didn't ask questions of a man in his position. I never took a penny myself. I swear it before God and everyone here. I only wrote what he told me to write." "One question, Mr. Corrie," Selwyn said, gently. "Did Mr. Reeve ever tell you why?" The silence stretched. "He said," Ned managed, "that he'd trained a man once who was thrown out with nothing after 20 honest years, and if honesty bought a man that little, he didn't see why he ought to trouble himself with it either." The name Grace had found in the false-backed desk did not need saying aloud after that. She said it anyway, quietly, into the stillness, her father's name, and watched Silas Reeve's face do something she had not expected, and, despite everything, could not entirely refuse to pity. Not fury, not fear, but a kind of collapse. The grief of a man who had spent 11 years building a fortress out of a grievance, and found, now that the last wall had come down, that there was nothing left inside it but the grievance itself. Small and old, and no longer worth what it had cost him. "I trained under your father," he said to Grace, not to the room, and watched him take the credit while I did the figures no one wished to do themselves, and when they turned on him I told myself it was no more than the world does to men like us, and that I had simply learned the lesson early. "I did not expect," he said, and his voice, for the first time in 6 weeks, was not gentle at all, that his daughter would be the one to teach it back to me. Gideon rose then, and the room rose with him in that instinctive way rooms do around a man about to render judgment. But what he said was not what the servants' betting book had wagered on. "You will leave Hallamere by nightfall," he told Reeve, "and you will not return to this county. I will not prosecute you, not for your sake, but because a trial would cost this estate's tenants a winter's uncertainty they have not earned, and because I find I have had enough, this season, of punishing people for other people's ruin. You will have an allowance, small, quarterly, paid through Mr. Term. Selwyn, enough to live honestly if you choose to, for once to learn how. That is more mercy than you extended to a dead man's name, and I give it for the sake of the living, not the guilty." Reeve did not thank him. He only looked once at Grace, with an expression that was neither apology nor defiance, but something worn thin between the two, and then he was gone from the hall, and from Hallamere, and, within the month, from the county entirely, and the storm that had been gathering all morning broke at last against the tall windows in a hard, clean rain that Grace would remember, afterward, as the sound of something finally being washed clean. He found her 3 evenings later in the estate office, where she had gone back to the almshouse ledger out of nothing but habit, the widow's account now marked paid in full in her own steady hand. He did not sit across from her this time. He stood in the doorway a moment, turning the signet ring on his smallest finger, and then he came and took the chair, and set on the desk between them her father's private ledger, which she had lent to Selwyn as evidence, and which now, she understood from the folded letter tucked inside its cover, had done more than clear a widow's name. "Selwyn has written to the trustees at Fenimore," Gideon said. "Your father's old estate. He has laid the whole of it before them, Reeve's confession, the dates, the letter in his own disguised hand. They are prepared to issue a public correction. Your father's name will stand where it should have stood these 3 years, in the county paper, in the parish record, wherever it was ever written down wrong." Grace found she could not for a moment make her voice work at all. "That is not owed to me," she said finally. "It is not offered to you," he said. "It is owed to him. What I owe you is separate, and I find I have been turning it over for 3 days without finding the right words for it, which is unusual for a man who has spent his whole life being handed the right words by other people. You are not required to owe me anything, Your Grace. I told you the truth, because it was the truth. Not for payment. I know that," he said, and something in his voice had gone unguarded in a way she had not heard from him before, not even by candlelight over the ledgers. "That is rather the difficulty. If I offered for you now, you would have every right to think it gratitude, or guilt, or the particular kind of foolishness a man falls into when a woman has just saved him from the worst mistake of his life. I would not blame you for thinking it. I have thought it myself, testing the idea the way you test a column, looking for where it does not balance. And did it balance? No, he said. It came out larger than gratitude every time I added it. I am not offering you a rescue, Grace. You do not need one, and I have learned this summer what it costs a person to be handled like something that does. He reached into his coat and drew out a single folded sheet, and set it before her, and she saw, before she had even unfolded it, that it was the note in his own hand countersigning her dismissal, the one that had ended her access to the very ledgers, now proving her right. I have kept this, he said, as a reminder that I am capable of forgetting myself when it matters most, and I find I would rather spend the rest of my life being reminded of it by you than spared it by anyone else. Marry me because you wish it, Grace. It is the only reason I will take. Not the widow's cottage, not my mother's fondness for you, not anything I owe your father's memory, only that. Outside the window a robin that had nested in the hedge all summer set up its evening song. Indifferent to dukes and ledgers both, and Grace looked at the folded note in her hand, and then at him, and found that for once in her life the sum came easily. You forgot yourself once, she said, in a forecourt in August, and called me forward instead of quiet. I find I have never once regretted forgetting myself back. It was answer enough. He did not kiss her hand the way a man does in a play. He simply reached across the desk and closed his own hand over hers, ink-stained fingers and all, and held it there while the rain that had followed Michaelmas cleared at last from the county, and the last of the evening light came slantwise through the window and lay warm across both their hands and the old ledger between them. They were married quietly in November, in the small chapel at Hallowmere, rather than the county church, with no more than 30 souls present, and Mrs. Pruitt weeping so thoroughly into her good handkerchief that the dowager finally passed her a second one, and told her, not unkindly, to compose herself before she frightened the vicar. Widow Coombes sat in the second pew, in a bonnet trimmed fresh for the occasion, her granddaughter beside her, the cottage secured to her family for 3 lives by a document Selwyn had drawn himself, and the Duke had signed before witnesses, so that no ledger, honest or otherwise, could ever again hold her home hostage to a column of figures. Ned Corrie, who might have been dismissed with Reeve and was not, having been more fool than thief, took up a post at a neighbouring estate on Gideon's own recommendation, and wrote to Grace every Christmas after, with a steadiness that suggested a man determined never again to let another man's cruelty pass for his own conscience. Louisa Fenwick, who had recanted her own quiet doubts about Grace the moment Ned's testimony broke the room open, stayed on at Hallowmere through the autumn, and left it in spring newly and genuinely engaged to a baronet's second son she had, by her own cheerful admission, only truly noticed once she stopped measuring every room for a duke. Silas Reeve was heard of once more, the following winter, in a letter to Selwyn from a small parish 2 counties distant, where he had taken honest work as a clerk under another man's name for his own accounts, and by all report kept them well. The dowager told of it, only said that some men required losing everything before they learned what an honest column looked like, and that she supposed it was mercy enough that he had finally learned it at all. Grace's father's ledger came to rest, framed under glass beside his corrected name in the county paper, on the wall of the Hallowmere estate office, where every new agent who ever sat at that desk would be obliged to read, before touching a single figure, the sentence Aldous Marlowe had taught his daughter before she could properly write. A ledger does not lie, only the hand that keeps it does. It was there, exactly a year after that first hot August forecourt, that Grace stood again on the very same stones, a shawl of her own now settled over her shoulders against the turning season. When a young tenant farmer's widow came hesitant up the drive, with a fistful of receipts and a fear in her face that Grace recognised at once, because she had worn it herself once, in another woman's kitchen, kneeling on a cold, swept floor. "I've come about my rent," the woman said. "I've heard tell the new Duchess reads the books herself and settles what's fair. And Grace, who understood exactly what it cost a poor woman to say such a thing aloud to a great house, only smiled and held out her hand for the papers, the way a friend holds out a hand rather than the way a judge extends one, while behind her, on the terrace steps, the dowager rose from her chair without being asked, unhurried, entirely certain, as though rising for widows in her own hall had become. At last, simply the custom of the house, and if this story warmed you, the way a lit window warms a traveller who was not sure, until they saw it, that anyone was keeping watch for them at all. Then stay a while longer by the fire with us, pull your chair in, let the kettle sing, and tell me in the comments which line stayed with you longest. The argument in the forecourt, or the receipt held up to the light, or the moment a mother rose without being asked. If you would like to keep a place kept warm here for the next story, the door is always open when you subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means to us rather more than a ledger ever could. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle as you can, with the quiet ones in your own life, who have been keeping their own lamp lit far longer than anyone ever thought to notice.